So this is the story of Ruth, and it begins with Ruth and Naomi, and it's such a sweet story of loyalty and faithfulness on Ruth's part. And there's so much we can learn from her about our marriages, about our relationships with family and friends, and about our relationship with God. And so let's just get right into it. In Ruth 1, it says, "It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land." Now, that's all we know about the time frame. So it was sometime within the time that the judges were ruling that this happened. It's speculated that this was in the time of the judge Jair, which would have been in the early 1100s BC, but we don't know for certain. Just sometime within the judges, there was a famine in the land. And so a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Malo and Chilion. These were Ephrathites of Bethlehem of Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. And so when it says Ephrathites of Bethlehem, the name of this town used to be Ephrath. We know this because it says that Jacob buried Rachel in Ephrath, which later became Bethlehem. And so they're just trying to say they're from this place that most likely was called Ephrath at the time that they moved, and is now called Bethlehem at the time of the writing of this. And so Jewish tradition says that Samuel is the one that wrote this book, but it doesn't say who wrote the book of Ruth. Some say he could not have, because in this book at some point it talks about King David, and David had not been made king by the time that Samuel died, but he had been selected as the next king before Samuel died. And so it could definitely still be Samuel. Either way, it's most likely that the town was named Ephrath whenever Elimelech left, and now it's called Bethlehem at the time of the writing of Ruth. So just a little information as to what you're reading and why it's giving all of these speculations. Now, we also need to talk about Moab. If you will remember, this is directly east of Bethlehem, just across the Jordan River. So it would make sense for them to just go across the Jordan River into a land that wasn't struggling with a famine. And this was also the land that was given to Lot's descendants. The Moabites are Lot's descendants. And remember, Lot was the nephew of Abraham. And so all of these people are descendants of Abraham. Israel is a descendant of Abraham through Isaac, and then Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel are Jacob's 12 sons. And then the Moabites are descendants of Lot. And so God has given them this land, and they were not allowed to touch it, the Israelites. They could touch all the rest of the land that was around it, like take it over, but they couldn't take over the Moabite land because it belonged to Lot's descendants, Abraham's family. And so they've moved into this land, and it says that they've gone there to dwell. Some of the versions say sojourn there. And that gives the impression that he's just a guest there. He's going to a foreign land to stay for a temporary time. And then when the famine is over, then he'll presumably return back to Bethlehem. Now, it says in verse 3, "Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. So presumably Elimelech died before the famine was over, and his sons maybe were, young when they moved there and now have become of age. And so they both marry, and it says they've been there for about 10 years. Now, the Israelites were forbidden totally from marrying anyone in Israel, in the promised land, because all of those people were from other nations that worshiped other gods. They were actually supposed to, completely eliminate all of the people living there, but they did not do that. And God said they're going to be a snare to you. They're going to try to get you to worship their gods. And so if you intermarry with them, you most certainly will. And so they were completely forbidden from that. They weren't specifically forbidden to marry people from any other nation, but it was frowned upon because every nation had other gods. And then there was specific instructions about marrying Moabite women, because when they left Egypt, the Moabites came out and fought against them. And then when the second generation came and they were about to cross over into the promised land, they were dwelling in the land of Moab or near there. And the Moabites were afraid. It says they're too great in number for us, and we're afraid they're going to take us over. And we've seen what they've done to these other nations. And so the king Balak, he hired a man named Balaam to curse them. And he thought, we can't defeat them militarily, so we're going to get them cursed. And God prevented Balaam from cursing them and actually made Balaam bless them instead. And so obviously Balak is furious, but Balaam comes up with another plan, and he says, hey, you can't defeat them militarily, and God won't allow you to curse them. But what you can do is you can join an alliance with them and get them to marry with your daughters. And then that will weaken them from within, because it'll pull them away from their God and towards your God, which is exactly obviously what God was afraid of. And they did do this. And they began to worship the gods of Moab. And it says God killed all of the men who did this, who worshiped Moab's gods. And so then after this, God makes a specific declaration on Moab. And this is in Deuteronomy 23, 3-6. It says, an Amorite and a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. And then in verse 4, it says, because they didn't meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, which is what I said, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God wouldn't let Balaam curse you, and he turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. So you shall not seek peace with them, nor prosperity all of your days forever. So they weren't supposed to make any more alliances with the Moabites, and they couldn't bring any of the Moabites into their assembly until the 10th generation. And so these were the specific laws against Moabite women, marrying Moabite women. But these two boys have married Moabite women. Maybe it's, past the 10th generation by this point. Either way, this is the way that it has gone. And then in verse 5, it says, then both of the boys died. And so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. And then she arose with her daughters-in-law that they might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Now, coincidentally, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And we know that this is where Jesus was born. And Jesus is also called the bread of life. And so maybe that's why it's named that. Maybe it's because of this, and they rename it after the famine. And that gives way to Ephrath and Bethlehem and the changing of the names. Either way, it's interesting that she says that he gave them bread, and it's called the house of bread. And it says, therefore, she went out from the place where she was, she and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, go, return each to your mother's house, and let the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Now, the dead is her sons. So you were kind to me and you were kind to my sons. And so I pray that God deals kindly with you. And then in verse 9, the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. And so she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. So she's saying, none of you have any children, and so you should go back to your mother's house and find a husband. And I pray that you do find a husband and that you're able to have children. And I'm sorry that it didn't work out with my sons, but you need to go back home. Now in verse 10 it says, they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. So they're like, no, we don't want to go back to our family. We'll go with you. And Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, then should I bear sons? Would you wait for them until they're grown? Would you restrain yourself from having husbands? She says, no, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And so it was customary that when a husband died, then his unmarried brother would marry his widow to carry on the family name. And so that's what she's saying. She's like, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. And I'm too old to remarry and have any children. And by some chance, I'm not too old. I'm wrong. And I'm able to have children. And I were to possibly marry someone right now and get pregnant, then you would have to wait until that child was grown. And so are you really going to do that? Or are you just going to keep yourselves as widows for, 20 more years in hopes that you can have a husband in 20 years? No, that's not possible. You need to go back home to your mothers. I'm so sorry. It makes me sad, but this is the way it is. And so it says, then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah left, but Ruth was not having it. She's like, no, I cannot leave you. And so then Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so first let's address Orpah. She, it says, went back to her people and to her gods. And this brings us to, again, the reason that God doesn't want them intermarrying with other people is because it might encourage the Israelites to worship the gods of their wives. Thankfully, in this situation, it seems that the women instead began to worship Israel's, their husband's God. And so that would presumably be why it was okay that they married these women, because they did not adopt their gods. They made the women adopt their God. And so these two women have fulfilled the requirements of, when you would marry someone from another nation is if they were willing to completely leave the culture of their nation and live under Israel's rules and under Israel's God. And there is provision made for that. God does say if someone from another nation is willing to live the same way as you do and live under God's rules and make him their God, then they can actually become part of Israel. And this is written in Exodus 12, 48 and 49. It says, when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all of his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat of the Passover. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among him. So he's saying you don't get to be different if you live in Israel. You don't get to act like you did in your other culture. If you want to come and live here, then you need to assimilate. That's basically what he's saying. If you love this nation so much, then there must be a reason that you love this nation. There must be a reason that you want to live here. And presumably it is because of the way that we do things. And so you should do things the way that we do them, which means worshiping God and following his ways. And if you're willing to do that, then you can be a part of our nation. And so even though the boys were living in Moab, they were still doing the things of the Israelites. They still had Israel's God and lived under God's rules. And the girls have adopted this also, even though they're living in Moab, because they're living under their husband's household. And in their husband's house, they worship God and not the gods of Moab, right? And so we're going to go back to the contrast between these two women in a second and the beautiful words that Ruth said to Naomi. But I want to finish the passage just so that we can then go back and focus on that area. And so it says that when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to get her to leave. And it says, now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they came to Bethlehem that all of the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. The reason she said this is because Naomi, the word Naomi, means pleasant or sweet, and the word Mara means bitter. And so she says, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me. And then she says, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Naomi and Ruth traveled to Bethlehem from Moab, and they say that was about 60 to 75 miles, which would have been somewhere between 7 to 10 days that these women are traveling alone to this new land. And then they get there just in time for the barley harvest. And when Naomi gets there, everybody's excited. She's obviously a well-known person. They are completely aware of who she is, and they're so excited that she's come home. And they say, oh, wow, this wonderful woman that we've been missing, she's come home. And Naomi's like, it's not a good thing. I came home because I lost my husband and my sons. God has dealt bitterly with me. You know, I left because I was lacking bread, but I am more lacking now in my return because I've lost my family. And all I have with me is my daughter-in-law, which is great, but that means that both of us are now without husbands. And so she says, you know, the Lord has dealt bitterly with me.